There are movies that entertain you. There are movies that move you. And then, once in a very long while, there is a movie that quietly rewires the entire world, changing what people hum on their morning walks, what parents sing to their children at bedtime, what strangers in foreign countries recognize across every barrier of language and culture. The Sound of Music is that film. It has been called the most beloved musical in cinema history, and by almost every measurable standard, that title holds up. But here's what most people do not know. The version of that film you've seen, the one that feels so perfectly constructed, so warm and inevitable, very nearly did not exist at all. What survived in the theaters was the polished surface of something far messier, far stranger, and in some moments, far more dangerous than anyone in Hollywood was willing to admit. For decades, the studio kept a tight lid on what actually happened during production. Cast members were instructed, with varying degrees of formality, to keep certain things quiet. The official story was clean and triumphant. A beloved Broadway show translated smoothly to film by a visionary director, starring a luminous actress who charmed the world. That version of events was good for business. It was also, in significant ways, incomplete. Because the real story, the one that unfolded in rain-soaked Austrian meadows, inside a small glass gazebo, on a choppy mountain lake, and on sound stages wrapped in the noise of malfunctioning equipment, is something altogether different. It is a story about accidents that became masterpieces, misery that produced magic, and moments of genuine crisis that the studio buried so effectively that it took the principal cast members themselves, speaking out years later in interviews and memoirs, to finally let the truth surface. This is that story, and now that it can finally be told, it deserves to be told properly. To understand why The Sound of Music nearly collapsed before it was ever made, you have to go back to the source, to Maria von Trapp herself, the real woman behind the legend. Maria was not a Hollywood creation. She was not a myth. She was a deeply religious, fiercely independent Austrian woman who had actually lived the extraordinary life that would one day fill theaters around the globe. She had married a widowed naval captain, helped raise 7 stepchildren, performed with her family across Europe and America, and ultimately fled the Nazi annexation of Austria by crossing the mountains into Switzerland with little more than faith and determination. She had written about all of it in her memoir, and in the early 1950s, German filmmakers had purchased the rights to that story for a sum that would later become one of the most quietly devastating deals in entertainment history. Maria received a single, one-time payment. She signed away more than she understood, with no agent advising her, no lawyers reviewing the fine print, and no concept of what the story she was selling might eventually become worth. She needed money for her family and her missionary work. She took what was offered and moved on. By the time Broadway came calling, by the time Mary Martin and her husband Richard Halliday became consumed with the idea of bringing the Von Trapp family to the American stage, Maria was completely unreachable. She had taken herself deep into the mission fields of Papua New Guinea, traveling with the family's longtime music director Father Franz Wasner, running clinics in remote villages, living without electricity, and existing almost entirely outside the modern world. Letters arrived at various mission posts in great stacks. Maria, focused entirely on the work in front of her, did not open most of them. She tore up the correspondence from America without reading it. To her, it was noise from a world she had left behind. Halliday eventually intercepted her on her return voyage to the United States. He was waiting at the pier in San Francisco when Maria disembarked, and he pressed 2 tickets into her hands, tickets to see his wife perform. Maria went, perhaps out of courtesy, perhaps out of curiosity. What she witnessed on that stage clearly stirred something in her. And so, despite the rights complications, despite her own ambivalence about having her family's story performed for mass entertainment, she offered a cautious blessing. They could try. She could not promise them anything, but she would not stand in the way. That quiet, tentative agreement set in motion one of the most consequential chains of events in American theatrical history. When producers first assembled around the idea of a Von Trapp stage musical, the original creative vision was modest. The thinking was straightforward. Use the actual folk songs the Trapp family singers had performed in their touring years, the authentic Austrian melodies that had already charmed European audiences, and simply thread a few new compositions through the narrative to give it some Broadway texture. It was a practical, reasonable plan. It was also, as it turned out, exactly the wrong approach. When that proposal reached Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein, the most celebrated composing partnership in Broadway history, the men behind Oklahoma, Carousel, South Pacific, and The King and I, the response was unequivocal. They were not interested in writing bridges between someone else's music. They were not interested in filling gaps. If they were going to be part of this production, they were going to write the entire score, every song from the ground up, or they were going to walk away and let someone else do it. There was no middle ground, no negotiation, no compromise on offer. The producers paused. Rodgers and Hammerstein were occupied finishing Flower Drum Song, so the Von Trapp project was set aside temporarily. But when the partnership eventually returned to the material, what they created was something no one had anticipated. The score they produced was not simply serviceable, it was staggering. Song after song emerged that would outlive every other element of the production. Melodies so instinctively human and emotionally precise that they embedded themselves into the global consciousness almost immediately. The opening number that painted a landscape through sound. The playful teaching song built from a musical scale that children could absorb without knowing they were learning. The quiet dignified him to a mountain flower that carried an entire nation's longing inside it. The soaring anthem that climbed towards something larger than any individual story. These were not just good songs. They were the kind of compositions that make people feel that music was invented specifically for moments like the ones being described. And they owed their existence entirely to that firm, uncompromising refusal to do anything halfway. While the songs were being written and the stage production was being mounted, the eventual path toward the film version was quietly beginning to take shape. And one of the central challenges, one that the studio would struggle with for an uncomfortable amount of time, was finding a man willing to play Captain George Von Trapp. On paper, the role was appealing. He was the emotional anchor of the entire story, a man of military bearing and emotional repression who is gradually unlocked by love, music, and the irrepressible spirit of the woman who comes to teach his children. He was dignified, handsome, complex. He had a journey. He had range. And yet, when director Robert Wise began approaching the actors who should have been lining up for such a role, he encountered rejection after rejection. Serious dramatic actors with the right physical presence and gravitas looked at the script and saw a musical. They saw children and singing and sentimentality, and they quietly declined. The names that circulated in early conversations, serious, celebrated leading men of the era, each represented a version of the film that never came to be. The role sat unclaimed, a significant problem for a production that was rapidly moving toward its start date. Christopher Plummer was not the studio's first choice. He was not even among the early candidates. He was a stage-trained actor with considerable classical credentials, known for intensity and precision, deeply committed to challenging material. When the offer reached him, his response was something close to contempt. He read the script and found it saccharine beyond his tolerance. He found the sentiment cloying, the story too soft, the whole enterprise beneath the kind of actor he wanted to be. He said no. He said no again. He continued saying no through multiple overtures. What finally changed his mind was not the money, and it was not persuasion in any conventional sense. It was a direct appeal from Robert Wise, who flew to London specifically to sit across from Plummer and make a personal case. And critically, Wise was willing to negotiate with Plummer about the character himself, willing to let the actor help reshape who the captain actually was on screen. Plummer wanted depth where there had been shallowness. He wanted genuine emotional stakes. He wanted the character to have a private interior life that the audience could sense even when it was not being stated outright. He wanted a song that belonged to the captain alone, not a performance for an audience within the film, but a moment of genuine personal vulnerability. That insistence gave birth to Edelweiss. It is worth stating clearly, because the misconception is widespread. Edelweiss is not an Austrian folk song. It is not a traditional Alpine melody handed down through generations. It was written specifically for this film by Rodgers and Hammerstein to give Christopher Plummer's character the private emotional moment he had demanded as his condition for accepting the role. The song that millions of people around the world associate with Austrian national identity, a song that has been sung at patriotic gatherings, played at state events, taught to school children as a piece of cultural heritage, was invented in a negotiation between a reluctant actor and a persistent director. Plummer showed up. He honored his commitment. He delivered, on screen, a performance of genuine power, restrained, layered, and in its best moments genuinely moving. But what he revealed in interviews and in his memoir years later was that his relationship with the production during filming was one of active, ongoing misery. He disliked being in Salzburg. He found the city's picturesque beauty oppressive rather than inspiring, a kind of enforced cheerfulness that grated against his sensibility. He drank heavily throughout the production, by his own admission, and he was not quiet about the fact that alcohol was part of how he survived the experience. He said later that some of the most emotionally demanding scenes were filmed while he was substantially intoxicated, not as a confession of failure, but with a kind of rueful, darkly comic candor that suggested he found the irony instructive. Among those scenes was the performance of Edelweiss at the festival. The moment in the film where the captain's voice breaks, where his composure finally gives way, where the audience sees the full weight of what he stands to lose. It is the scene that many viewers identify as the emotional peak of the film. It is the scene that Plummer, decades later, described filming while heavily impaired. The tears that viewers interpret as the character's genuine grief were, by the actor's own account, at least partly the product of someone who had consumed far more than was strictly advisable before the cameras rolled. The performance was real. The emotional access was chemically assisted. The effect on audiences was, apparently, identical either way. And there was another dimension to Plummer's complicated relationship with the film that he considered a more direct professional insult. When it came to the singing, particularly the sustained high passages and the more technically demanding vocal moments, the studio had already made a decision without fully consulting him. A professional singer named Bill Lee, whose vocal work had graced Disney productions and other major Hollywood films, was brought in to perform portions of the captain's songs. Plummer's speaking voice, his transitions, his phrasing and dialogue-adjacent moments, those remained. But the full musical performance the character required was, in significant part, not his voice at all. Plummer was furious. He felt the decision was a dismissal of his capability, a quiet judgment that he was not sufficient for the role as fully imagined. What made the situation stranger was how invisible the scene was. Audiences could not detect the transition. The blend between Plummer's actual voice and Lee's vocal performance was so well executed that for decades, viewers simply assumed they were hearing one continuous performance from one actor. The illusion held completely. But for Plummer, who knew exactly where the line was, it was a source of genuine, lasting resentment. Of all the production stories that the studio worked hardest to suppress, the one involving the gazebo scene is perhaps the most perfectly absurd. The scene itself is among the most romantically iconic in the film. Soft light, a quiet night, two people finally acknowledging what has been building between them across the entire story. It is a scene that has been imitated, parodied, and cited in discussions of great romantic filmmaking for 6 decades. The reality of filming, it was chaos. The lighting setup required for the scene involved large carbon arc lights, industrial equipment that generated the intense, concentrated illumination needed to simulate moonlight convincingly on film. These machines were powerful, hot, and loud. And the sound they produced, a long, resonant, deeply undignified noise that bore an unfortunate and unavoidable resemblance to a very emphatic bodily function, emerged every time the equipment was operating at full intensity, which was every time Julie Andrews and Christopher Plummer moved close enough together to film the scene. The timing was catastrophic. The moment the two actors positioned themselves for the romantic centerpiece, the the moment that the entire sequence had been building toward. The equipment would release its sound. Again and again, take after take. The crew lost their composure. The actors lost their composure. The emotional architecture of the scene, everything that had been so carefully constructed through performance and staging, dissolved every time into helpless, uncontrollable laughter. The serious lines, the tender confessions, the carefully calibrated intimacy of the moment, all of it was obliterated by the noise. Robert Wise tried everything within reason. He adjusted the equipment, repositioned the lights, modified the staging, altered the timing of the takes. Nothing resolved the problem. Hours passed. The budget was burning. The scene that was supposed to represent the film's romantic peak remained completely unfilmable under the original plan. Wise eventually made a decision that was, in the most literal sense, forced upon him by circumstances. He abandoned the lighting setup entirely. Instead of illuminating his actors, he placed them in front of the glowing windows of the gazebo and shot the scene in silhouette. Their faces were largely obscured. The details of their expressions, which is normally what carries a romantic scene, were replaced by outline and suggestion. The soft, dreamy quality of the sequence, the visual poetry that viewers have always associated with that moment, was not the result of artistic intention. It was the result of a director improvising around equipment that kept making fart noises every time his two stars tried to kiss. Andrews eventually told the story publicly years after the film's release on a television talk show. She described the experience with her characteristic precision and wit, recalling the almost unbearable absurdity of trying to maintain romantic sincerity under those conditions. The audience laughed. The story became part of the film's legacy. But for decades before that disclosure, the studio had ensured that no one involved with the production said a word about what actually happened inside that gazebo. The scene that viewers experienced as effortless and inevitable was, behind the screen, a complete disaster from beginning to end. The chaos was not always comic. During the boat sequence, filmed on one of the Alpine lakes near Salzburg, what was intended as a controlled, choreographed piece of family comedy came within seconds of becoming a tragedy. Kim Carruth was 5 years old. She played Gretel, the youngest of the Von Trapp children, and she was the smallest figure in the boat when it was designed to tip and spill the children into the water for the scene. Before filming, the crew informed Julie Andrews that Kim could not swim. The plan, communicated clearly, was for Andrews to position herself to catch the child the moment the boat went over. It was a simple safety protocol, executed under controlled conditions, with professional crew members nearby. When the boat tipped, Andrews fell in the wrong direction. She went backward, away from Kim, rather than toward her. Kim went under. She surfaced and went under again before another cast member. Not the designated safety personnel, not the person whose job it was, but simply an actor who reacted quickly, pulled her out of the water. Kim swallowed a significant amount of lake water. She was sick afterward, and the fear she developed in that lake on that afternoon stayed with her for years. Andrews was shaken deeply by what had happened, and she said so afterward without any of the careful diplomatic framing that studios typically encourage. The incident was real and frightening and came close to something none of them wanted to contemplate. The boat scene that appears in the finished film looks playful and bright. The children tumble into the water and emerge laughing, and it reads as charming family comedy. What it actually was on the day they filmed it was a near drowning that the studio did not publicize, that was not included in any of the promotional materials, and that remained largely unknown to the public until cast members discussed it privately in interviews given many years later. The opening sequence of The Sound of Music is one of cinema's most recognizable images. A figure in a meadow, arms open to the sky, turning in a wide circle as the camera pulls back and the landscape of the Austrian Alps unfolds beneath an enormous blue sky. It is joyful and expansive, and it communicates in about 30 seconds everything the film wants to say about freedom and possibility and the life that awaits its protagonist. Filming it involved a helicopter flying approximately 20 feet above Julie Andrews' head. Each pass of the helicopter to capture the aerial perspective generated a wind force strong enough to knock Andrews flat onto the grass. The downwash from the rotor blades hit her with what she later described as something comparable to a full-body collision. She would get up, straighten herself, compose her expression back into the radiant openness the shot required, and the helicopter would come around again. She was knocked down repeatedly over the course of shooting the sequence, at least 6 or 7 times by her own count, possibly more. She discussed it in later interviews with the combination of genuine amusement and barely concealed incredulity that characterized her public recollections of the more physically demanding moments of the production. The scene looks like the opening of a dream. Filming it felt, she said, like being tackled from above by something very large moving very fast. The image that has come to symbolize liberation and lightness was produced by an actress who kept picking herself up off the wet grass, straightening her dress, and walking back to her mark. Throughout production, the financial situation at 20th Century Fox was precarious in ways that made every cost overrun feel like a potential catastrophe. The studio was already carrying enormous debt from Cleopatra, a production so spectacularly over budget that it had damaged careers, ended marriages, and come astonishingly close to destroying the studio entirely. Fox had spent money it did not have on a film that had consumed everything around it like a financial black hole. And then, with that wound still open, they purchased the rights to The Sound of Music for a price that industry observers considered either courageous or reckless, depending on their disposition. They sent a director and a crew of more than 250 people to Salzburg, Austria, to film in locations that looked perfect in photographs and proved, in practice, to be subject to some of the most persistently uncooperative weather in the region's recorded history. 1964 was, by most meteorological accounts, an exceptionally wet year in Salzburg. Robert Wise had planned for 6 weeks of location shooting. He got 11. The rain that fell on schedule after schedule, the fog that obscured mountain shots, the mud that made meadow sequences impossible, all of it translated directly into money. Hotel rooms for the cast and crew, equipment maintenance costs, additional catering, overtime wages, insurance complications. Every day the cameras could not roll was a day the studio was paying for people to sit in damp coats and wait. The studio executives watching the budget reports from Los Angeles were not calm. There were internal conversations about whether the production should be shut down, whether the location work should be abandoned, and the remaining scenes recreated on sound stages.